He had opened the door that morning and had groped interminably for the switch, holding the jam in his usual death grip. His eyes squinched shut, the tip of his tongue poked from the corner of his mouth like an agonized rootlet, searching for water in a place of drought. Funny? Sure, you betcha. Look at you, Georgie. Georgie's scared of the dark. What a baby. The sound of the piano came from what his father called the living room and what his mother called the parlor. It sounded like music from another world, far away, the way talk and laughter on a summer-crowded beach must sound to an exhausted swimmer who struggles with the undertow. His fingers found the switch. Ah! They snapped it. And nothing. No light. Oh, cripes! The power! George snatched his arm back as if from a basket filled with snakes. He stepped back from the open cellar door, his heart hurrying in his chest. The power was out, of course. He had forgotten the power was out. Cheesley Crow, what now? Go back and tell Bill he couldn't get the box of paraffin because the power was out, and he was afraid that something might get him as he stood on the cellar stairs? Something that wasn't a commie or a mass murderer, but a creature much worse than either? That it would simply slither part of its rotted self up between the stair risers and grab his ankle? That would go over big, wouldn't it? Others might laugh at such a fancy, but Bill wouldn't laugh. Bill would be mad. Bill would say, "Grow up, Georgie. Do you want this boat or not?" As if this thought were his cue, Bill called from his bedroom. Did it die out there, Georgie?" "No, I'm getting it, Bill," George called back at once. He rubbed at his arms, trying to make the guilty goose flesh disappear and be smooth skin again. "I just stopped to get a drink of water." "Well, hurry up." So he walked down the 4 steps to the cellar shelf, his heart a warm, beating hammer in his throat, the hair on the nape of his neck standing at attention, his eyes hot, his hands cold, sure that at any moment the cellar door would swing shut on its own, closing off the white light falling through the kitchen windows, and then he would hear it. Something worse than all the commies and murderers in the world, worse than the Japs, worse than Attila the Hun, worse than the somethings in 100 horror movies. It, growling deeply. He would hear the growl in those lunatic seconds before it pounced on him and unzipped his guts. The cellar smell was worse than ever today because of the flood. Their house was high on Witcham Street, near the crest of the hill, and they had escaped the worst of it, but there was still standing water down there that had seeped in through the old rock foundations. The smell was low and unpleasant, making you want to take only the shallowest breaths. George sifted through the junk on the shelf as fast as he could. Old cans of Kiwi shoe polish and shoe polish rags, a broken kerosene lamp, 2 mostly empty bottles of Windex, an old flat can of turtle wax. For some reason, this can struck him, and he spent nearly 30 seconds looking at the turtle on the lid with a kind of hypnotic wonder. Then he tossed it back. And here it was at last, a square box with the word Gulf on it. George snatched it and ran up the stairs as fast as he could, suddenly aware that his shirt tail was out, and suddenly sure that his shirt tail would be his undoing. The thing in the cellar would allow him to get almost all the way out, and then it would grab the tail of his shirt and snatch him back in. He reached the kitchen and swept the door shut behind him. It banged gustily. He leaned back against it with his eyes closed, sweat popped out on his arms and forehead, the box of paraffin gripped tightly in one hand. The piano had come to a stop, and his mom's voice floated to him. "Georgie, can't you slam that door a little harder next time? Maybe you could break some of the plates in the Welsh dresser if you really tried." "Sorry, Mom," he called back. "Georgie, you waste," Bill said from his bedroom. He pitched his voice low so their mother would not hear. George snickered a little. His fear was already gone. It had slipped away from him as easily as a nightmare slips away from a man who awakes, cold-skinned and gasping from its grip, who feels his body and stares at his surroundings to make sure that none of it ever happened, and who then begins at once to forget it. Half is gone by the time his feet hit the floor, 3/4 of it by the time he emerges from the shower and begins to towel off, all of it by the time he finishes his breakfast. All gone until the next time, when in the grip of the nightmare, all fears will be remembered. That turtle, George thought, going to the counter drawer where the matches were kept. Where did I see a turtle like that before? But no answer came, and he dismissed the question. He got a pack of matches from the drawer, a knife from the rack, holding the sharp edge studiously away from his body, as his dad had taught him, and a small bowl from the Welsh dresser in the dining room. Then he went back into Bill's room. "Well, what an a-hole you are, Georgie," Bill said, amiably enough, and pushed back some of the sick stuff on his night table. An empty glass, a pitcher of water, Kleenex, books, a bottle of Vicks Vapor Rub, the smell of which Bill would associate all his life with thick, phlegmy chests and snotty noses. The old Philco radio was there, too, playing not Chopin or Bach, but a Little Richard tune. Very softly, however, so softly that Little Richard was robbed of all his raw and elemental power. Their mother, who had studied classical piano at Juilliard, hated rock and roll. She did not merely dislike it, she abominated it. "I'm no a-hole," George said, sitting on the edge of Bill's bed and putting the things he had gathered on the night table. "Yes, you are," Bill said. "Nothing but a great big brown a-hole, that's you." George tried to imagine a kid who was nothing but a great big a-hole on legs and began to giggle. "Your a-hole is bigger than Augusta," Bill said, beginning to giggle too. "Your a-hole is bigger than the whole state," George replied. This broke both boys up for nearly 2 minutes. There followed a whispered conversation of the sort which means very little to anyone save small boys. Accusations of who was the biggest a-hole, who had the biggest a-hole, which a-hole was the brownest, and so on. Finally, Bill said one of the forbidden words. He accused George of being a big, brown, shitty a-hole. And they both got laughing hard. Bill's laughter turned into a coughing fit. As it finally began to taper off, by then Bill's face had gone a plummy shade, which George regarded with some alarm, the piano stopped again. They both looked in the direction of the parlor, listening for the piano bench to scrape back, listening for their mother's impatient footsteps. Bill buried his mouth in the crook of his elbow, stifling the last of the coughs, pointing at the pitcher at the same time. George poured him a glass of water, which he drank off. The piano began once more, for Elise again. Stuttering Bill never forgot that piece, and even many years later it never failed to bring goose flesh to his arms and back. His heart would drop and he would remember, "My mother was playing that the day Georgie died." "You gonna cough any more, Bill?" "No." Bill pulled a Kleenex from the box, made a rumbling sound in his chest, spat phlegm into the tissue, screwed it up, and tossed it into the wastebasket by his bed, which was filled with similar twists of tissue. Then he opened the box of paraffin and dropped a waxy cube of the stuff into his palm. George watched him closely, but without speaking or questioning. Bill didn't like George talking to him while he did stuff, but George had learned that if he just kept his mouth shut, Bill would usually explain what he was doing. Bill used the knife to cut off a small piece of the paraffin cube. He put the piece in the bowl, then struck a match and put it on top of the paraffin. The two boys watched the small yellow flame as the dying wind drove rain against the window and occasional spatters. "Got to waterproof the boat or it'll just get wet and sink," Bill said. When he was with George, his stutter was light. Sometimes he didn't stutter at all. In school, however, it could become so bad that talking became impossible for him. Communication would cease and Bill's schoolmates would look somewhere else while Bill clutched the sides of his desk, his face growing almost as red as his hair, his eyes squeezed into slits as he tried to winch some word out of his stubborn throat. Sometimes, most times, the word would come. Other times it simply refused. He had been hit by a car when he was 3 and knocked into the side of a building. He had remained unconscious for 7 hours. Mom said it was that accident which had caused the stutter. George sometimes got the feeling that his dad, and Bill himself, was not so sure. The piece of paraffin in the bowl was almost entirely melted. The match flame guttered lower, growing blue as it hugged the cardboard stick, and then it went out. Bill dipped his finger into the liquid, jerked it out with a faint hiss. He smiled apologetically at George. "Hot," he said. After a few seconds, he dipped his finger in again and began to smear the wax along the sides of the boat, where it quickly dried to a milky haze. "Can I do some?" George asked. "Okay, just don't get any on the blankets or Mom will kill you." George dipped his finger into the paraffin, which was now very warm but no longer hot, and began to spread it along the other side of the boat. "Don't put on so much, you a-hole," Bill said. "You want to sink it on its maiden cruise?" "I'm sorry." "That's all right. Just go easy." George finished the other side, then held the boat in his hands. It felt a little heavier, but not much. "Too cool," he said. "I'm going to go out and sail it." "Yeah, you do that," Bill said. He suddenly looked tired and still not very well. "I wish you could come," George said. He really did. Bill sometimes got bossy after a while, but he always had the coolest ideas, and he hardly ever hit. "It's your boat, really." "She," Bill said. "You call boats she." "She, then." "I wish I could come, too," Bill said glumly. "Well," George shifted from one foot to the other, the boat in his hands. "You put on your rain stuff," Bill said, "or you'll wind up with the flahoo like me. Probably catch it anyway from my germs." "Thanks, Bill. It's a neat boat." And he did something he hadn't done for a long time, something Bill never forgot. He leaned over and kissed his brother's cheek. "You'll catch it for sure now, you a-hole," Bill said, but he seemed cheered up all the same. He smiled at George. "Put all this stuff back, too, or Mom'll have up a bird." "Sure." He gathered up the waterproofing equipment and crossed the room, the boat perched precariously on top of the paraffin box, which was sitting askew in the little bowl. "Georgie?" George turned back to look at his brother. "Be careful." "Sure." His brow creased a little. That was something your mom said, not your big brother. It was as strange as him giving Bill a kiss. "Sure I will." He went out. Bill never saw him again. 3. Now here he was, chasing his boat down the left side of Witcham Street. He was running fast, but the water was running faster, and his boat was pulling ahead. He heard a deepening roar and saw that 50 yards farther down the hill, the water in the gutter was cascading into a storm drain that was still open. It was a long, dark semicircle cut into the curbing, and as George watched, a stripped branch, its bark as dark and glistening as sealskin, shot into the storm drain's maw. It hung up there for a moment and then slipped down inside. That was where his boat was headed. "Oh, shit and Shinola!" he yelled, dismayed. He put on speed, and for a moment he thought he would catch the boat. Then one of his feet slipped and he went sprawling, skinning one knee and crying out in pain. From his new pavement-level perspective, he watched his boat swing around twice, momentarily caught in another whirlpool, and then disappear. "Shit and Shinola!" he yelled again, and slammed his fist down on the pavement. That hurt, too, and he began to cry a little. What a stupid way to lose the boat. He got up and walked over to the storm drain. He dropped to his knees and peered in. The water made a dank, hollow sound as it fell into the darkness. It was a spooky sound. It reminded him of... Huh? The sound was jerked out of him as if on a string, and he recoiled.